In the US, there's a broadly held narrative that if you're experiencing poverty or financial hardship, it's solely your fault. After all, others have picked themselves up by their bootstraps, and so can you. This is a common narrative that we fight here in the United States, thinking that poverty is a result of choices rather than systematic oppression that often impacts so much of our communities. Today, we're breaking down this exact concept with this amazing CEO. Jesus joins the show, who is the CEO of UpTogether. Today, we're having a conversation about scarcity mindset, about serving the community, about impact, and about innovating in spaces where the people need our help. Let's get into the episode.
I moved from Puerto Rico when I was almost 10 years old to Amherst, and I went from a place of scarcity to a place of abundance. And understanding from those two positions, as I got older and I studied and I learned that I was a victim of essentially that move. That if I would have stayed in Puerto Rico, my life would have been different. And I got to see how others suffered as a result of those systemic issues. And I couldn't articulate it in quite the same way, but I knew that these inequalities were designed and affecting folks. And I was really clear because of my own experience. I was like, well, if we can do something about this, why wouldn't we try?
So, Jesus, in our previous conversation, you asked me a really important question. I think it's a great place for us to start off on today's conversation. You said, if you were making brownies in your house and ran out of sugar, would you go to the store or would you go to your neighbor? Why did you ask that question? And what does the answer show us about the current state of our communities?
Yeah, I think for me in this work, for anybody to really understand the challenges that come with people facing financial hardship, but also the isolation and the lack of vulnerability that we're feeling to be able to seek support and guidance and take it away from a dollar value, but to our own personal experiences. I've learned that that's one of those questions that people all of a sudden is like, all right, like there's something fundamentally that is missing in our society that we used to have that we no longer can have. And so that question to me, and I've gotten to ask it across the country. And I think like you can always tell with people, there's an aha moment of like, oh, wow, right. Why can't I do this anymore? And I think it speaks to this bigger piece that as a country, like we're beginning to see, right, the trends of isolation that are occurring more and more. And, like the simple term of, everybody's more connected than ever, but more alone than ever, right? And I think that really weighs on an inability for us to look for those personal connections, for that vulnerability to occur, to really upend that isolation that is continuously to grow inside of the country.
I remember hearing the simple phrase when I was a kid, and we heard it all the time in school, right? United they stand and divided they fall. And it seems like today in society, especially here in America, we are more divided than ever, meaning it seems like we're tackling challenges that we come across from a societal perspective as an individual. And man, is it tough to turn the tide when you feel like you're the only person out there.
Yeah, and I think for the last, and it does like coincide with the way that we've been distributing our resources, right? Since the early 80s, we've been othering this problem of support, of investment in people, and saying, well, everybody else needs these things and they come at your expense. And you should really be protective and catching and holding whatever resources you can grab, because that's the way that you'll be able to succeed. When historically, the opposite was true, right? That actually when we have a really strong abundance of investment in people and their abilities and those connections, everybody thrives and everybody does better. And I think that has contributed greatly to the point now, and I think, Keena, to your statement, which is like, we don't even feel like we can even have conversations with one another because we have such a perception that the gap in between our understanding, our common understanding, is so wide, it's not even worth a conversation.
Ooh, that's a really interesting nuance to kind of double click on. We have an assumption, right? And that assumption is keeping us from digging deeper, which is often where we find that common ground. And I feel like that's kind of an underlying current of this. I want to, first of all, I have to give you some props. We are closing in on 15 years that you've spent working in and building up the organization UpTogether. So by the time this releases, we're going to be closing in on that 15 years, man. So huge congratulations there. I want to talk about what drew you to this organization specifically and the big challenge that you guys are trying to fight.
Sure. So I had been working as a community organizer in Boston, and then growing up inside of a small organization that had been able to get some size, and an ability to be able to affect change in the community that we work with, which is Jamaica Plain, the High Jackson Square neighborhood, the organization, the High Square Task Force. And in doing that work, I'm working specifically with young people and doing organizing. Like I lived in the community. I got to do this. I got to see the change. Yet I had aspirations of saying, like, wait, can we take this to a bigger scale, right? Like, can we help sort of promote these sets of values about investment in people and giving them the critical tools that they need to affect change? And I understood that there was like a ceiling in the nonprofit sector to be able to do that at scale in that way. Timely that I was then invited to hear from the founder of the then Family Independence Initiative, Mauricio Lynn Miller, who shares about coming after a number of decades in social service work, feeling similar frustrations and an inability to be able to affect change inside of a community, even though he had grown an organization to a significant size and had dedicated so many resources to it, and being recognized as one of the best in the country and feeling like a failure because he knew he wasn't reaching that community-wide impact. And that resonated with me, as well as then sort of stating and saying, and we're consistently looking at the people most affected by poverty and saying, you're not part of the solution. We can do for you, which ran against my own understanding and my own work in organizing, which is always people are the answer. So that sort of awakened, and I was just like, yeah, why are we letting go? Why are we giving up on these people constantly, right? Like, we're constantly told they can't do better. Let's try to fix them as best as possible. And so I was lucky enough to be hired as a director in Boston of the new branch of this work, and quickly, by connecting with people, got it even at a deeper level of the opportunity. And at that point, it's sort of like, I always compare it as taking the blue pill or the red pill in the matrix, right? Like, once I was unplugged, I was like, I can't see it the same way again.
You know, there's an amazing quote in your guys' website, and I want to kind of use that as a segue into talking about this macro challenge that we're dealing with, right? On your guys' website, it says, in the US, there's a broadly held narrative that you're experiencing poverty or financial hardship is solely your fault. After all, others have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and you can too. Why are we getting this so wrong, man?
I think that initially the concept came into being, hey, there's people struggling with hunger. There's people struggling with meeting their day-to-day needs. We can create a way to be able to address that, right? And I think whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. or Robert F. Kennedy, like, they saw an opportunity, Lyndon B. Johnson as president, say, like, well, we can fight poverty. We can do something about it. And that doing something about it became institutionalized in a way that by the time the late 70s and 80s come about, that people were just like, that mindset of like, well, why can't you figure this out by now? Why are we continuously putting money on you and having to save you in that way to be able to meet those basic needs? Not seeing the systemic challenges that people were facing for their inability to be able to do better, right? Whether it is some of the historical ones, such as racism, sexism, segregation that came with that racism, or the way that we instituted policies like redlining that were based on racist policies to be able to take away value, dollar value inside of these communities. And, we talk about these things as they were a thing of the past, but they very much exist today. But I think to your question, that at that point in the 80s, then they were like, well, we can just vilify these folks, put the blame on them, and have government take away the responsibility of having to support them and care for them because it's their fault in that way. And it was that false narrative that I think, A, took away money and resources from people, but B, started investing in wealthy individuals who then gather so much wealth that they didn't know what to do with and create a philanthropy to a point now that it's a multi-billion-dollar business that is now continuously on the back of poor people, looking back at those same folks and saying, well, I can help you do better. Not recognizing all of the advantages that they have gotten to be able to build that wealth, and that those advantages actually, when applied to any person, they'll be able to build a wealth for themselves as well.
I think it's really important to kind of double click on the systemic issues that we're dealing with here. Now, I was talking to another amazing CEO in the nonprofit space out of a food bank in Alabama. And he was talking about, one of the biggest challenges we have in the sector of community services, nonprofit work, is often the leaders of these nonprofit organizations come from middle to upper middle class lifestyles and values. And so when they come into these community-based, populations of people who truly need help, they're looking at it through the lens of their lived experience. But one thing that you cannot understand is when I'm looking at Jesus across this digital table, I'm looking through my lens of experience. But when you're looking back at me, there might be invisible layers or traps that stop you from coming to this side of the table. And I feel like unless we truly empathize and understand everyone's true conditions and challenges, it's very difficult to speak from a higher level at people who can't even understand what you're saying because of all the perceived obstacles for them to be able to be as beneficiary of the system as you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, going back to like why I asked that question, like oftentimes I'm trying to get people to stop thinking of how do I affect these individuals who are facing this poverty and to begin to think of themselves and what they benefited from. What were critical moments of either investment or a connection or a network that catalyzed them to be able to do the next best thing for themselves, that they drove that for themselves in all sorts of different ways, whether it's like a parent or an acquaintance being able to be like, oh, you're trying to get that job? I'll make a call for you. Mm-hmm. Or a parent or an acquaintance being like, oh, you want to start this business? I got a check for you. Or you're going to buy a house? Here's the mortgage underwriter you should go to, right? Like all of those pieces, all of a sudden, like it takes away from that othering and goes like, oh, that's right. This is how I benefited. This is how I was able to stabilize. This is how I learned. And the people that supported me in that learning to be able to do better, which is over and over and over and over again the case, right? And yet, when you're given a chair and a desk, and you sit around a boardroom and you're said, hey, there's people who are struggling with poverty. What should we do about it? It's not me, right? It's them. And what can I do for them? And I think your point then even makes it harder when you've never been in the position. You've never had those life experience. You've never gotten a sense of what racism is. Personally, to be able to be like, well, we don't have to deal with those things. We can just concentrate on helping you learn how to be able to manage your checkbook, because that's what's going to make a big difference. And you take a small action in a day-to-day life as indicative of a way to change a life, which is just not true, right? Like it's the cumulative effect of all of those contributions that make a life, and those connections and those relationships and those investments, not managing your checkbook, right? And that's the conversation that we oftentimes get in the middle of. That is just like, well, I know better. I know if I manage a really good checkbook, things will be better.
It's almost a misconception that we're speaking like there's a silver bullet to be able to change these issues and solve these problems rather than 100 golden BBs that we have to be able to address, right? It's a huge misconception.
And I think simply put, going back to this concept is, well, you don't have to figure it out. Stop sitting in a boardroom trying to figure it out. Your best resource is always the people who are affected by these challenges, by those current conditions. Put them in the position to be able to figure it out. And I guarantee you, you're going to learn something. There's going to be a benefit as a result of that. And you don't have to spend a huge amount of money on infrastructure. You don't have to like develop outcome charts to like test and iterate on how to get the equation right for these individuals. Like they will always get it right. They know the equation for themselves. There's going to be failures along the way, but that's something that we're all afforded. And especially if you are in the upper tiers of society, you are afforded a huge amount of failure. For those who are higher stakes, all of a sudden you're like, well, you can't fail because of that. No, that's not true. Like everybody can fail.
Which is more dangerous? To have won and to not know why you won, or to have lost and understand why you have lost, Jesus?
I think the latter, because, and again, I think, again, from a very personal experience, for that kid who right now is struggling to get the nourishment that they need, the basic, just, and we see it an epidemic right now and homelessness, right? Like I'm in Oakland, California. I can't tell you the crime that it is that there are so many kids in the Oakland public school system who right now are homeless, right? And who are thinking about that meal. And I think that, when you shed away an inability to have those basic needs, it makes it really hard for you to see anything else. Mm-hmm. And I think if we are truly can be a place of opportunity, and also like I really love as people talk about communities that have been economically depressed, how many Einsteins we have here, who has the ability to build the next rocket or cure the next disease or come up with the next wonderful website that you're going to love. Like we're depriving ourselves of our best resources and our best minds and thinking. But that requires your imagination to understand that, to your point about filters, that you eliminate those filters and everybody is going to contribute. They may not contribute the way you want to, but they're going to contribute.
This is a really interesting perspective to me as I'm a business owner, and a common conversation that we hear across the landscape of business, right? And I'm just using this as an analogy, is if you want really good talent, you should go overseas. Eastern Europe is a hotbed right now for developers and other technical talent. Pay them less, get great returns on that. But one of the things that I think is kind of a narrow-sighted perspective on this is if you would just look around, the talent is around you. But the people who need the, I would say, equitable step into the position where they can show up just aren't getting it. And it seems like we're robbing our own future as a country by looking elsewhere because we're looking for a quick return instead of investing into the people who actually need it, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and at all times undermining that investment like repeatedly, and then being like, well, how come like we can't get that same kind of talent? Right, like those folks are so much more hardworking, like they have this go to want to be able to contribute at a level that we really don't see here. But I would argue that's exactly right. There's not only that ability, but there's enough wealth here that if we are doing that at our best, it actually will trickle out in a much more equitable way and sustainable way outside of the walls of this country, and could potentially have a really positive, powerful impact.
I mean, think of a world, Jesus, where we are the talent bed, where people are being picked to go to other parts of the world because of how hard we work and how talented we are. Like, what a dream for the American culture.
Yeah, and to that end, like we become our best export, which is like, right, like the funny part of imperialism, right? Like it's just like, oh, let us always force and take for our gain at that expense. It's like, no, actually, if you do this with generosity, with love, with support, you don't have to force anybody. People will want to, right? I had the privilege to go to South Africa probably about 18 months ago. and to learn about the country and its history. Obviously, that's really complex, and the sort of the effects of apartheid. But one of the things that they talked about was the right now China and Russia see the talent that is there, and they're just like, why aren't we investing more here? Why are we connecting them, and benefiting, right? And having this allyship, right, with South Africa. And one of the South Africans said, it's like, ain't nobody in South Africa saying that they want to be affiliated with Russian or Chinese culture. No, they want Levi's, and they want, right? Like, they want to be associated with US culture, but we don't give them the time of day, right? And we're not looking to expand our investment in them. And I use that as a way to, I think, your point of thinking we can not only care for ourselves, we can be caring for others as a result, but we limit our ability to do so because of this sort of thinking that somehow we're going to be able to get the most toys at the end.
It seems like we are constantly, robbing from Peter to pay Paul instead of coming from a place of abundance, right? And this was a conversation I was having with a young entrepreneur, a guy here in Las Vegas. Tyler, shout out to you, because we always see each other in the gym. And he was saying, from his belief in the bigger system of faith, he said, one of the things that I've been taught is in some of my toughest times, I have to go out with a heart of abundance to provide for other people who have less than me, and those returns will come back to me. He said, I just randomly came across this activity, something that was going on. I won $625 cash, and man, I needed that $625. But I had a feeling that came over me where I said, I should just go out into the streets of Las Vegas and hand out these $100 bills to people who need it more than I do. What happened the next day? Customers started flowing his way. And he said, man, this is a true lesson in having a mindset of abundance. If we can serve others, the good benefits will come back to us. I want to talk a little bit about the scarcity mindset that we talked about in our previous conversation and some of the, I would say, intertwined strings that we've been pulling on in today's conversation a little bit.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the easiest way I can describe it, right? Like when we think about like the largest wealth transfer that has ever happened in this country, it happened after World War II and the GI Bill, and our ability to be able to have anybody who wanted to be able to purchase a home. And the U.S. government was the underwriter to be able to get those monies out to people to be able to purchase their homes. And it stabilized that generation, right? Like, we are here built on that investment. Now, I want to add parenthetically, right? Like, it was done only for white individuals in this country. Nevertheless, it had an impact of one that is still being counted. Like, people are still inheriting wealth out of that action. And there was never a question, right? To that segment of the population, they were like, well, they just delivered for us, and we are going to deliver back to them. And we're going to put them in a position to get education, to get housing, and be able to then have an impact. And it led to one of the largest levels of prosperity in this country. Equally, like, there was a middle class, right? It grew. And I think that, today we propose that, and people would be like, well, how are we going to pay for that? And who's it going to benefit? And how will we structure it? And how do we limit it? Or is it something that we can really afford? The question really becomes, is it something that we can't afford, right? Like, whether it's healthcare, whether it's housing, whether it's public education, I think that continuously saying that we can't afford to invest in people and those abilities and meeting those basic needs is what is really beginning to continue to show all of these symptoms in our country and this divide, but also the hunger, the scarcity that people are feeling in their lives to be able to make ends meet. And we're continuously just piling onto that by taking more and more away from them.
I mean, this is an underlying current of the American society. You know what I mean? Which is, I need to accumulate more for myself and stop others from having what I already have. And I feel like there's a conversation that we should kind of touch on here, which is the younger generation seems to be more aware of these problems than any other generation did. I'm not sure if it's because of social media and everything else that I see, but I can't tell you how many times, even the other day, this popped into my mind as we were sitting here. I saw a girl who put out a TikTok personal page, 350,000 people liked this video. And she was breaking down what it would cost to end homelessness, to end hunger in the United States, to be able to put people in all of these different situations. And the numbers did not total up the total amount of money that we just gave to another foreign country for aid. And she said, let's break down these numbers again. She went very enthusiastically back down through the numbers. And she was like, we sent more money away than what we need to be able to reinvest and solve all these problems that are affecting our society today. And I feel like the younger generation is not going to put up with the idea of our government continuing to hand things out, but being scarce in that mindset about helping our own people here, which is really challenging.
Yeah, and I will build on that real quick, right? Like if it was philanthropy doing it, they'd be like, well, then what's our return on that? And what are we, it's like, well, hold on one second. What's been our return on these hundreds of billions of dollars that we've invested in bombing others or supplying the military ability for people to fight these wars? How does it make our day-to-day life better? And I understand that there may be ways that people say, well, there's less of this or less of that in regards to violence coming into this country. But the bottom line, though, is that you're absolutely right. Going back to the paying Peter to whatever the refrain is. This is where like my Spanish like loses. Okay, but it absolutely is undermining the country to be able to provide some basic institutional supports that we can build from. And the opposite is happening. It's actually saying, and take out those institutional supports, right? Privatize your ability to provide education to people. Privatize healthcare where only people who have the resources can get good healthcare. And even at that, right? Like it doesn't even mean now that you can get good healthcare because we've taken those components away.
There's a really interesting blurb or quote that I like to bring into these conversations. The scariest experience is obtaining the life that you thought would make you happy, but it not feeling how you hoped for. How many times will we make this same mistake? This is a common issue that so many people deal with. And we kind of just touched on it with the American idea of let me accumulate, hoping that it's going to fill this dark hole that I have inside of me. Now, in our previous conversation, you referenced a study that is going on at Harvard. Talk a little bit about that and how it's the antithesis, if you will, to the exact problem that we just talked about.
Yeah, so it's been happening now for, I believe, 7 or 8 decades, and a book came out last year to show a little bit about its results that they've seen. But essentially, they started with just a small group of men and being like, I think mostly plugged from Harvard and saying, like, what will their trajectory be over the next 10 years? And essentially, they've been able to get the funding to expand that over decades and grow it into not just from these small set of white men, but a much more diverse population. But essentially, the bottom line is that it's our relationships that fulfill us, is our connections that actually provide us with good, not only that sense of fulfillment, but also a sense of good health, of an ability to thrive in our old age. And that isolation and holding and being sort of closed off to the world will not only give you poor health, but also lead to an early death. And those are, like, when you think about, if that's true, if we know and have proven that that's true, then what are we doing, right? Like, where is in our national budget a way that we're investing in one another, in those connections, in the way that we support, in the places that we can, like, whether it's the arts or the commons, like whatever the place may be, for us to be able to celebrate and enjoy one another in those relationships. And I often say that piece because when we talk about like giving people money, they always like that. They're like, oh, we could just fix it by giving people money. It's like, no, what we're doing is eliminating the pressures of that scarcity for people to have the ability to build that life for themselves. That includes having others around them that support them and help them get to a place of thriving.
And this is a really a conversation that needs to be had more often in public settings like this, because I'll tell you what, Jesus, some of the scariest experiences I've ever had in my life were chasing materialistic items, finally getting to the point where I could afford those items, purchasing those things, and then having it change nothing about my life. Have you ever had a similar experience as you've kind of matured through time?
Well, um, a little bit, but what I will say is that I always made really bad decisions in my own personal life for community. My mom will not like me saying this, but I remember like leaving college and being like, well, what makes me happy? Working with people makes me happy. Like making an impact makes me happy. And this is late 90s. So taking a job in this sector at that time was not really beneficial to my bottom line. But I was like, and I leaned actually the only reason I was able to move to Boston was because my aunt took me in. And I remember my mom looking at me one day and was just like, so when are you gonna like get a real job, right? Like you're doing this work in community. And so I think for the most part I got really lucky because I would repeatedly look to what I knew would fulfill me from that place of impact. And I want to add and say that I was really unique in not a lot of folks around me were necessarily thinking in that. And you could even say um, I could have benefited from thinking a little bit more as to how to be able to build wealth for myself. But I will add that I think that was instructive to me is that, I moved from Puerto Rico when I was almost 10 years old to Amherst, and I went from a place of scarcity to a place of abundance. And understanding from those two positions, as I got older and I studied and I learned that I was a victim of essentially that move. That if I would have stayed in Puerto Rico, my life would have been different. And I got to see how others suffered as a result of those systemic issues. And I couldn't articulate it in quite the same way, but I knew that these inequalities were designed and affecting folks. And I was really clear because of my own experience. I was like, well, if we can do something about this, why wouldn't we try? And I think that has led me to a place where, yeah, no, like, I like my wife and I like laugh all the time because we're like always use our dollars to be able to have life experiences, not so much as gather things. Not to say that we don't have nice things, but for the most part, we're always negotiating in that way.
And I'm really proud of you for that, man. And that's a mistake that so many of us have made in our careers. And I talk to so many CEOs about this exact journey. Often we have that voice inside of our head that tells us we need to accumulate certain things to be the person, to be the leader, the CEO, how society's going to view us. But we can tap into that truth like you did very early about realizing what's important to you and what gets you up and helps you show up every single day. I'm jealous that I wasted so much time, honestly, because of, hearing that some people were so tapped in so early.
But can I just emphasize two things? One is obviously I laugh at myself because there was a naivete, right, to it that I was just like, just go do this, right? Like, but I was also so blessed. Like, I can count the people who understood me and what I wanted and would put their arms around me and be like, I'm going to help you. And every once in a while, buy me a nice steak dinner. But I think like that is to me what has always been lasting. That I like even today as I've progressed in this work, I often feel like I've compromised some of that now for the work, and I want to go back and be like, I miss those relationships. I have to come back. I have to keep them and dedicate as much time as I do to this work to them, because and other times on the feeder, right? Like I will not be able to contribute to the same way in this work as I have. And they're the ones who are going to like give me my outlets as I need it as I get older. So I think that part, and I'm sure you have it in your own life, like the community, the people who hold you up in spite of your inability to do it is what got me this far.
Yeah, I've always, there was a saying that I heard on a podcast one time. I am a family business. My co-founders in this business, my father, we started this back in 2014, so we just crossed 10 years. My younger sister has joined the business as well. And people often say, don't do business with your family. It's a huge
Yeah.
mistake. But I heard the other day on a podcast, somebody said, you know what life is all about? It's all about figuring out who you want to live life with and doing that with them. And I always think about the blessings that I have of the people who have been there to lift me up when I couldn't do it for myself. Those are the most important assets that I have in my life. The cars, the computers, the technology, the things, the watches, all that kind of stuff. Take it away. But it gets really fundamental when we think about the people in the community who are around us, who can lift us up, because they're going to be for us. They're going to be there for us much longer than all those materialistic items will.
That's exactly right. And I think going back to like the experience for most, the fact that we are not positioning them to make those sorts of decisions in their lives, that instead we're always asking, how are you contributing, in what way, and how much are you getting? It's like we're off balance. We're absolutely off balance. And we're like stealing away our ability, I think, to thrive as a society as a result, because we're concentrated on the wrong things at all times. And the easiest way, I keep laughing because I knew my son the other day was like making fun of the commercials. Like when we sit down and watch a football game, like take this screen for eczema, right? And it's like, wait, what are we like? How do we promote the way that we want our society to be supportive of one another? It frustrates me to heck. And then I have to like find my narrow view and be like, no, I think if we can continue to get on this track, I know I can have the impact that at least will create enough of a ripple that I can feel proud that I contributed to the best of my ability.
How do you keep that perspective in focus? When it comes to, community-based services, nonprofit, CEO, as an example, burnout, incredibly high. And I wonder if that's because we're on such a long journey that often it's difficult to appreciate how far we've come on this journey rather than how far we have to go.
Yeah, I think that's right. We have to do a much better job of, like that, and I'm going to mess up the refrain, but, I don't want your revolution if I can't dance. Like, I think we need, going back to like, yeah, no, this is good. This is great work. And like, when's the party? Like, who's bringing the DJ? Who's bringing the food? And how do we break bread and celebrate and support one another? And I'll tell you, I've been guilty of that as much as anybody else. Of like just being like, oh, let's get through this. The impact is so much more. So many people depend on us. But if we don't do a good job of, I think, taking the time to do that sort of celebration and enjoyment, we're at a disadvantage because we're not living to the values that we want, and we're not instituting and seeding, right, the society that we want. But I will add that burnout is real. I'm seeing it in my own organization, and we're not alone. And I think that because we're in the people business, right? Because our return is individuals and community who are facing oftentimes some of the hardest challenges in our country, that it's hard to like pick back. Like I woke up this morning, I was thinking, I need a vacation, right? And it's been a few months, and it's like, no, like you need to find those places. So that's one thing. I think that the other is I'm really lucky. I have an incredible wife who is not only supportive, but also forces me to ensure that I create the divide and we find the time together with our family. I have a 14, a 12, and a 6-year-old. And
you're busy, man.
Every night they're like, so what's for dinner? And it's like, all right, like it forces you, right, to focus on the things that really matter.
There's a tradition that we have here, Jesus, on the podcast. Our previous guest asks you a blind question. I'm interested to hear how you're going to answer this. Okay. What is the most recent thing that you've done that scared you, and why?
try. I took kids to the kids to like an amusement park, and maybe there was one ride in there that I got a little jittery, but that scared me. I would say in general, my like the place that gives me the most angst, in, especially as a leader inside of an organization, is having to both be in a place that is a vulnerability, but also in that vulnerability, explaining hard decisions that will have an impact on people. And, it's, I'm associating a little bit of that angst with the feeling of being scared. And there's a little bit of both in that way. I think that would be, trying to think of like anything else. Like, I'm like, maybe like standing in like, if you get me really high, I'll look down, I'll be like, oh my gosh, no. But like, there's a similar feeling in that way. I haven't been scared that much in more recent days.
Let's double click on that answer a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, being vulnerable with the team, also having the bravery to be able to break hard news to people. Let's talk about that a little bit. I know that that's a scary process for a lot of leaders, but if you can give advice on how you kind of navigate that, that'd be super helpful for the audience.
Yeah, I think a few things. One is to position yourself to get clarity and like to sit with that clarity and to give your time. Like I try to meditate and just give myself like the position to eliminate as much of the inputs around you so that you can see what you're facing and feel confident about the direction that you're taking. And so at that point, even though I still have those feelings, I know that I've done what I need to do, because it can have a negative effect on a person. And then the second piece is to approach it with humanity, is to be able to say, man, like, I'm sure like for individuals, like this is not the news that you want, and or you may have a negative response to what I'm sharing, but I've done my piece. I'm going to do it with that generosity and an ability to hear and hold myself accountable to what is occurring at this time. And that I'm being present as a person, I think is the best that I can do in that moment.
And this, people, is the burden of leadership. It's a process. We have to continuously be better, be vulnerable with ourselves, put ourselves in a scary position to show up for other people, man. So Jesus, man, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been an absolute blast. And thank you so much for sharing so much about your story, your perspectives, how we can come together to be able to solve some of these macro problems that we're dealing with, man. It's been an absolute blessing.
Well, and thank you. These are important conversations. I'm happy to contribute in the way that I can, but I know that everybody's hungry. I think to your point around leadership and what is happening, to be able to continuously learn and grow and build. And so kudos to you and your team for putting this together.
Well, it's been an awesome time having you on the show, man. Everybody, that's a wrap. We'll catch you in the next one.